Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Iran, the U.S., and regional politics is our topic for today. At a time when the U.S. is highly involved in Iraq and a lot of problems in terms of the U.S. wallowing in the mire of Iraqi politics and the war there. At the time when the U.S. is deep in debt, $7-8 trillion of debt, and a lot of budget deficits and so on going. At this time, we find that there is like more talk about more war in the Middle East. And now the question is Iraq, with not only with Iraq, but also in terms of Iran and Syria. And there's a threat of widening the war there. So what does all that mean, and what does it mean not only to the peoples of the region and the Middle East, but also to people in the United States as well? We have two guests here to talk about this. Farideh Farhi, Adjunct Professor of Political Science at the department here at UHM, and Ramsis Lutfy, retired professor of zoology and also friend of Sabeel, who follows what's happening in the Middle East and in terms of U.S. Politics as well. So welcome to you both. And what can we say about what's going on, by way of introduction, in the Middle East now, given the recent events that are happening? Farideh?
In 2 seconds?
Well, not in 2 seconds, but you know.
Well, obviously, there is the question of Iraq, which is quite unsettled, and for the first time, it seems that some major players in the United States are worried enough that they are actually talking about the possibility of dividing Iraq into 3 different territories, folks like Senator Biden and others, in effect, you know, coming face to face with this reality that very soon Iraq might disintegrate. Therefore, there are folks who are actually proposing some sort of a preemptive move to suggest a disintegration, which, as far as I'm concerned, would be an extremely chaotic enterprise, even more chaotic than we already see today, because what people do not realize is how integrated Iraq is in many ways in terms of its ethnic population. So the idea of disintegration would involve real serious human catastrophe. Then on the other, then there is the question of Iran. Obviously, the tension at this point is the issue of Iran's nuclear program. The issue has been brought to United Nations Security Council, but obviously, in fact, last night, political directors of major players were meeting, and they were unable to reach a compromise on the issue of whether or not to impose sanctions, but actually whether or not to introduce a resolution that would effectively bring Iran's case into a Chapter 7 situation, which is to say that Iran's nuclear program is actually a threat to the peace and security of the world. So we have not even gotten to the question of sanctions, and there doesn't seem to be an agreement on this issue. And of course there is worry because the United States has threatened and in fact has gone and has used the kind of language that it used in relationship to Iraq, which is if United Nations does not do anything, it will lose credibility, and hence there is this possibility that the United States will do something on its own, possibly a coalition of willing to do sanctions, but since people think that those sanctions will not really work, then there is this very, very deep worry, especially since President Bush has not ruled it out that the United States will actually take preemptive actions and attack Iran's nuclear sites.
Yeah, they usually don't rule out anything, just like a matter of policy.
I see.
But what I want to do before ask Ramses to comment on things is to show a segment that we had seen in 2001. And the idea is Sankaran Krishna from Political Science was talking about the impact of the war, and we are now talking about Afghanistan, war on South Asia, and to see, like in hindsight, whether he was on target, so to speak, or that things happened in a way that favored the U.S. and not more chaos in the region. So Sankaran Krishna.
It doesn't seem to realize that most Muslims do not live in the Middle East. Most Muslims, in fact, live in the region from Pakistan, extending through India, through Bangladesh, into Indonesia, Malaysia. In fact, Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim country. It has over 110 million Muslims right there. Of course, if you looked at the US media, you wouldn't know that. You would think most Muslims in the world lived in Saudi Arabia, or maybe Iraq and Kuwait, or Iran. Given that we have such a large number of Muslims, I think the impact on South Asia is going to be fairly serious. There's at least two things I would specifically like to talk about. Firstly, Pakistan has a long, over 1,000-mile border with Afghanistan. If the United States pursues any military adventures in Afghanistan, it will have a really serious impact on Pakistan. The last time this happened, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and the United States used Pakistan as a base from which to help the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviets, the Afghan Mujahideen to fight against the Soviets. The legacy of that is felt till today. Academics have argued that the collapse of democracy in Pakistan and the resurgence of a military dictatorship there owes to the fight with the Afghans. Pakistani civil society has been fundamentally transformed for the worse because of the frontline role that Afghanistan had in the war against the Soviets, which was helped by the United States. I fear a repeat of that, only this time making things much worse all across Pakistan. The second impact that's going to be felt is, as many of you are aware, India has had a long-standing problem with the state of Kashmir, which is in the northernmost part of India and borders Pakistan. In a very small area, it also abuts Afghanistan, as well as on the eastern side with China. There has been a strong Kashmiri separatist independence movement for many decades. And in the last decade, many of the Mujahideen and other groups which were fighting against the Soviets when Afghanistan was invaded by the Soviet Union, many of those groups have now joined the fight against the Indian center in Delhi in the state of Kashmir. So any movement or any set of actions that encourages such groups in the northern and northwestern parts of the South Asian subcontinent is going to be bad news as far as India is concerned, because it's going to propel further the independence movement in Kashmir.
Yeah, I mean, this is good, I think, because more chaos is happening now in Afghanistan. And why is it important for now? Not only because of the chaos, because of all these kind of, saber rattling against Iran or Iran against the US and so on, shows that there would be more problems along those lines. So, Ramsis, would you like to comment on?
Well, the point here is that we forget that these lines of behavior or planning had been set in the 90s by the group which we call now neoconservatives. And they were planning for wars in these regions. Of course, the main target for this is to control the oil wells in Central Asia and control all the regions between these wells, oil wells, and outlets on the Mediterranean and other regions, to control the oil industry all over the world. And this is part of the hegemonic plans of the group which we call the neoconservatives. So things did not run at all as they had anticipated. And obviously they hadn't had the support of professional military generals to tell them if this was possible or not, plausible kind of planning. So what we do now is that we forget that there is an Afghanistan war, and it's still going on. And of course, every day we are talking now about Iraq more than Afghanistan. But occasionally we get news about the Taliban still fighting, and we forget that the United States went into Afghanistan to follow the Qaeda. And for that, for going into Iraq and breaking Iraq eventually into three entities, as has been just mentioned by Farideh now, all these things had a very, very sort of complicated effect on the original sort of pretext that they went into these places for. So the whole thing is falling to pieces. And I'm afraid that whoever is in sort of power in the United States does not realize what's happening. And now, because of the approach of the elections in the United States, they started to behave or do things from hand to mouth. They are ad-libbing more than anything. They are not going through plans. Every day they have to do something to stop the slipping ratings of the government and try to sort of rescue the Republicans from the fate which they are going to face in the next elections.
Yeah, like, I mean, I'd like you to comment on, what Ramsis has said and also what we have seen. But the thing is that, is it really a question of just like ratings in terms of American politics, like a Republican, Democrat, so to speak? Or is it actually really beyond that these people, whoever is in planning the situation and the administration, are these people really understanding what's going on, and have they seen that recent history? I'm talking from 2001 till now, to see whether or not they would really, this saber rattling, say, against Iran, would really come to a certain positive conclusion for the United States.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that there is no doubt that we are dealing with a very, very ideological regime in the United States, whether its backbone is what Ramsis is talking about, or itself, the Secretary Rumsfeld's, the Dick Cheney's, and George Bush. And by that I mean essentially people who have a clear belief in American military power, and at least within the context of Afghan war and Iraqi war, they were convinced that massive superiority, and it is indeed massive superiority vis-a-vis any power in the world, will in effect allow the United States to pursue a muscular foreign policy in every arena. And therefore, in a sense, military prominence will allow the United States to pursue its economic, political, and strategic interests. What Iraq did is effectively undermine that fallacy. You remember people talked about Iraq being a cakewalk, and clearly, even if there was a plan, and some people had plans, it was not a well-conceived plan, because this was a very, very ideological administration. They really thought what they said, that if they go into Iraq, people will be there with flowers and candies, and there was nobody that supported Saddam Hussein, or nobody that led a good life under Saddam Hussein, and therefore, if you take away that good life, they would fight. They just did not conceive of those things. Now, that, I think, has become a lesson. Whether this administration, and I really do think that it is a limiting factor or a inhibitive factor, at least, in relationship to U.S.'s policy vis-a-vis Iran. Had Iraq gone well, I'm sure Iran would have been on the agenda next, and then Syria, and go on. But the reality is that United States, Iraq did not go well. United States is involved in a situation that is really a quagmire. Leaving is bad, staying is bad. United States military, from what I understand, the cost of the war is $10 billion a month. It's just a cost that cannot be sustained for very long. And more importantly, any kind of extension of this war would require troops. Which simply will not be possible without the institution of a draft in the United States. And so these are the inhibitive factors, not the mindset of the people that are in power.
Yeah, but also like here where the danger lies, I think, it's because they see that they are being frustrated from effecting their goals in terms of hegemony, etc. Becomes like they might say either miscalculate or say, well, to get out of this bind, we should like do something Prometheus unbound, and go forward. But that would be crazy. But that's ideological talk.
Well, and no, that's desperate talk. Is not. I mean, it goes beyond ideology. We're talking about desperation, and. The problem in relationship to Iran is because of the limiting factors, which is the inability of the United States to put troops on the ground. And remember, Iran is a huge country. Iran is much bigger than Iraq, and of course, it's a mountainous country. It's not, it has all the logistical problems that you will face in relationship to Afghanistan, except it's bigger, and we are talking about a population of 70 million people. And we know from past elections that at least a good 20% of the population, are diehard supporters of the existing regime, and they're ready to fight. So, so the limiting factor is just it would be totally chaotic for the United States to put troops on the ground. Now, what you would argue is that, okay, they would just, as they have talked repeatedly, they would just go and bomb various nuclear sites in Iran. And there are quite a few of them. People have done scenarios and have said that it would be as many as 1,000 targets, and many of those targets around the near cities. The dilemma that the United States faces in relationship to Iran is that, okay, you bomb 1,000 sites, then what? Okay, that is to say, you still have this regime, this quote-unquote evil regime, with all these instruments of power placed in different countries in the areas.
But you have destroyed the infrastructure like they did in Iraq.
No, they have, but
they will have.
But you cannot, given the way the Iranian government fights, or the way they have managed to organize their defensive capabilities.
This is important for Israel, for example. To destroy the infrastructure of these countries one by one.
Yes, but I mean, in terms of the United States, they will not be able to prevent the kind of attacks that the Iranians will be able to instigate in Lebanon, in Iraq, and elsewhere. So, and it's really a short-term solution. I mean, really, I mean, it is, as I said, I don't consider it to be an ideological move. I will consider it to be a desperate.
Desperate because of how they think.
And
illogical.
But let me say this. I mean, I agree that Iraq actually is where the hegemonic plan for the U.S. meets, a stonewall, shall we say. And this is something that, people in the administration have to realize or must realize soon. Otherwise, they'll get us into all these kinds of other problems, which would be bad for the peoples of the Middle East that will be involved, but also bad for the American people for one reason. One is that they're going to go and die there for whoever, not for like freedom and democracy, but for, Halliburton and the rest of them. And the other thing is in terms of budget cuts and stuff like that here, it would be just devastating. And also the question of the American economy would go down the tubes. Already the dollar is losing ground, has lost ground and so on against other currencies. So these are all big problems for the economy here and for the United States. But yeah, go ahead.
Excuse me, Ibrahim.
Yes.
Has this been a deterrent for the administration so far?
Well, that's the thing.
Who are the ones that are dying in Iraq?
Right. No, this hasn't been a deterrent. I mean,
Of
they
course.
don't care.
I mean, it isn't Rumsfeld's son
yeah.
or Cheney's son that's dying in Iraq. It's the poor man's army.
That's right. I agree with you.
No, but I mean, they are, look, there are certain deterrents that also impacts centers of power in the United States. It is true that the people who will be fighting are poor young men and women, and those who are making decisions don't care. But in the case of Iraq, for example, you clearly had an expectation in relationship to oil revenues that because of the insurgency it didn't occur. Okay.
Yeah, but
in the case of Iran, I mean, simply the world is not ready with the for the disruptions that will occur in relationship to the bombing of the Iranian infrastructure. So there are, I think there are powerful countervailing forces.
Absolutely.
That I mean, this doesn't mean that there are not people sitting someplace, whether they're part of Israel, some cliques in Israel or some cliques in American-Israeli Political Affairs Committee who have a conspiratorial and do relish instability in the Middle East.
Yes.
But I think there are enough countervailing forces in the United States who worry about that kind of instability for American interests, defined in terms of oil. I'm not talking about people's interests. I'm talking about oil interests.
Right.
So those are the countervailing
generals.
Of course,
Okay.
and this is why they are putting pressure asking for.
No, I agree. But I just want to say something quick about this question of the oil and the oil revenues from Iraq.
Yeah.
Even even if Wolfowitz was right, he wouldn't have been able to pay for the war through Iraqi oil revenues.
Yeah.
I mean, that was.
But his understanding was that the Iraqi people would. He really
Well,
believed.
I don't know about whether he
really
was
did.
lying or he believes.
Right.
If
No,
he
he
believes,
really believed.
he's stupid, and if he's lying, he's like ignorant.
Yes.
I mean, these are the people who are doing this kind of planning and putting everybody in.
He really believed that Iraq was a secular society.
Right.
Okay.
Some
He really believed that, and he was ignorant.
Yeah.
He was ignorant. He did not understand, and it was on that basis that they began to support the kind of Shiite uprising in Iraq, thinking that the Shiites in Iraq are secular. And now they are caught in this very, very difficult situation where the leaders of Iraq, every single one of them, has spent a good 10 years of their lives in Iran,
So their plans were naive from the beginning. I mean, they didn't know all...
It's not the question of they didn't know, it's just they did not want to know because there were people who constantly did tell them.
Ideologues,
Okay.
So I want to move to another thing. We're going to have like a segment from 2001 where you talked about how the U.S. and Iran are allies in terms of the Taliban, etc. So, I mean, it's interesting, this kind of thing. So we'll watch that and then we can comment.
In terms of the kind of dynamics that exist in the area. For instance, Iran is another country that is an ally of United States in this war against Taliban. So that's another unusual situation. However, what everybody is fearful of is that this military action that so far looks rather destructive, not only destructive of Taliban and Al-Qaeda network, but also the landscape and people of Afghanistan, that if it's not followed up by constructive action of creating something that at least was better than before, not necessarily greatly better, but at least a little bit better, then the implications are even worse than before, that you still have a failed state, you still have infighting in Afghanistan, and then you have all this anger towards the destructive power that has been unleashed by the United States in the region. So it's very important to think in terms of the implications and consequences of what is happening.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So what do we think now? I mean, what happened? The axis of evil or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you know, it is true, and information has come out that without Iran's help, United States would have had a much more difficult time.
In Afghanistan,
winning in Afghanistan, quote unquote winning. It was Iran's influence over the Northern Alliance that was extremely helpful. And then later on, in the meetings that occurred in Bonn over the constitution writing of Afghanistan, Iran and United States worked hand in hand. In fact, I was told by Ambassador Dobson, who was the American main person in Bonn, that in the morning it was the Iranian ambassador who came and told him this document is missing a word, and he said, what? He said it misses democracy. So I said, oh yes, and they actually had a good rapport. But then, you know what happened? Iran, after the help in Afghanistan, was called a part of axis of evil. It was a real shock to the reformist government in Iran, and I think ultimately a very, very important and sad chapter in American foreign policy, because it helped to undermine the reformist government in Iran, because the Iranian government, the reformists, had made an effort to extend their hand to the United States, and the United States not responding ultimately undermined them. But I think the other aspect which was discussed was what we feared actually happened, which was Afghanistan. The destructive power of the United States was unleashed, but the constructive part, because the attention was moved away to Iraq, just simply did not happen, or did not happen as much as it should have. Afghanistan remains a very, very violent place. Mr. Karzai still is the mayor of Kabul.
Part of Kabul, not all of it.
And more importantly, I think for our purpose, I mean, is that Afghanistan has now been turned into the most important producer of narcotics in the world. You know, opium, you know, produces 80%. The only thing that the Taliban did was to crack down on that trade. And now, you know, Afghani farmers have gone back into that trade in full force, and it's impacting the whole region.
The whole world, I think.
Well, but you know, more so because the kind of the drug trade that is going on has very, very sinister influence in Pakistan. It has very sinister influence in Baluchistan, which is, you know, the Iran between Iran. And of course, you know, it comes, the Afghanis, from what I understand, are not consumers of opium, because it's their bread and butter, but it comes into Iran. It has very, very devastating. It enriches, supposedly it employs about 400,000 people in Iran alone, the opium trade, but it also has a very sinister effect on the, you know, culture and lifestyle of people, because more and more people are becoming addicted. So, and then moves on to the world. So, so that's a very, very sad story in many ways that has been forgotten precisely.
Doesn't that reflect the zigzagging of American foreign policy? One day they, you know, are friendly with Saddam Hussein, and they convince him or urge him to fight against Iran, or encourage him to fight against Iran. And then the next day Saddam Hussein becomes a baddie, and he has to be gotten rid of. And Iran at one time, of course the history, since the 50s, our friend and then our enemy, and so on, and we are zigzagging. But I think that the straight line which Israel has been following is to cause the whole area to be unsettled, so that it can dominate it.
Yeah, I think, to just say that Israel likes it that Iraq has been destroyed.
Of course.
I mean, Iraq, the infrastructure, etc., and not only physical infrastructure, human infrastructure.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, there are professors at universities that hundreds of them are dead, assassinated already.
I know.
All the scientific elite and stuff like that are just being rid of. Yeah. And those who survive leave.
Israel would wish to see the same thing happening in Iran.
And Iran is the next, for them. Yeah, but as Farideh was saying, there are all kinds of countervailing, issues here that really prevent them from going for it, unless they are really absolutely nuts, But we'll.
No, I mean there is a major difference between Iraq and Iran, and the fact was that Iraq had invaded Kuwait and was under Security Council sanctions and no-fly zones for 10, 11 years. Yeah. That's not the kind of situation you have in Iran.
But that's the excuse they did for Iraq.
No. But in terms of the impact that it had on the Iraqi society and the kind of choke that both the sanctions and Saddam's rule had created on the Iraqi society, you ended up having very, very dysfunctional society.
This is one of the mistakes of the planners for the Iraqi invasion, is that they thought that because of these 10 years of breaking the back of the Iranian society, they are going to walk, the Iraqi society, they are to have a promenade, they are walking and get everything. Of course they did. But the after effect of the war, they won the war and will never win the peace.
And no, we don't know if they won the war because the war is still going on.
I know.
It's been going on since 1991. Let's say. Okay, it hasn't stopped. I mean, those people who say, "Oh, this is the second Gulf War," whatever, I tell them, this is the second Gulf War because there was the Iran-Iraq War was the first Gulf War, and this is 1991 till now is the second Gulf War. Yeah, it's only an invasion in 2003, but the war continues, and I hope it won't spread to the rest of the Middle East because that will be devastating for everyone concerned. So we have to try and fight for peace rather than go into more war. What I want to do now, if it's fine with us, unless you want to have something else, is to go to another segment, and we're talking about the things we're talking about now in terms of expansion of the war to other areas in the Middle East. I mean, the potential for it is there. It could be by mistake or whatever. So I interviewed Elton Daniel, 2002, October 8, 2002, and he talks about the regional powder keg, from all the problems that happening in the Middle East, have been happening in the Middle East, Lebanon and Palestine and the rest of it. So we'll watch that and then we'll get back to our discussion.
This is another thing that's at the heart of why there's so much anxiety among so many people about the thrust of this policy, is because you have a situation where everything that's been accomplished in Afghanistan, which is not a lot when you get right down to it, but it's hanging by a thread. It can disintegrate at a minute's notice. You have Pakistan and India at each other's throats, could become a war very easily. At any time, you have the Arab-Israeli problem that's sitting there festering, unresolved, getting worse and worse. You have the potential for all sorts of instability in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and other places. And they could, they're all connected in various ways, and they could very easily merge into some much larger, dangerous kind of conflict. And you would think if you're in a dark room full of gunpowder, it's not a good idea to strike a match. But this is essentially what this group in Washington wants to do, is to take a very high-risk gamble that has potentially explosive consequences, but to think that they can, that it's worth the risk to do it. And it's very disquieting.
Yeah, here it's very interesting to note that, in fact, as the war in Iraq is going on and the threats against Syria and Iran going on, there's a whole slew of other things happening. I mean, in Lebanon, anything that might happen to Syria, even an airstrike against Syria, might, strike a match in Lebanon itself. And so that would be counterproductive even for the Israelis, as an example. And we can continue on and on with that.
Although in the case of Syria, I think the Israelis have come to the conclusion that it is not a good idea to destabilize because the alternative is so
and there were reports that the Israelis are advising the Americans not to do anything.
That's right. So I mean, but the thing like miscalculations or whatever,
Yes, of course.
Or if they hit like Hezbollah in the south and so on. So there's all kinds of problems. And in fact, the internal politics, Lebanese internal politics, are very precarious at this point. So you don't know how the thing might
develop,
work, but anyway, or not work. So, but I want to go to a segment that Ramsis, you talked about in 2003 about things that we have been talking about, the U.S.-Israel axis, and what this has to do with the neoliberals and what they think, similar to what we were talking about. And we can continue the discussion from there.
In the historical context, obviously, the radical Arab nationalism is the main block or enemy in the face of control by the United States of the Middle East. I mean, the interests of the United States in the Middle East has the most dangerous element, which is defined as the radical nationalism, Arab nationalism. And of course, this is shared between the United States and Israel, to the extent that now Israel is the most indispensable element for the United States policies. And obviously, I mean, you can see that there is an axis between Washington and Tel Aviv, and this axis is feeding back and forth. Like, for example, Bush's advisors saying to Israel at one point, don't care and don't abide by these kinds of plans, peace plans and so on, and like Oslo, neglect it. And at the same time, Tel Aviv telling Washington, advising Washington to launch war on Iraq and eventually attack Syria and Iran and so on. So these are interests that are very commonly held by both sides. And that's why the whole thing is going to get into more serious and serious messes in the future.
Yeah, I interviewed. Okay. So, any discussion on that? So, what do you think now, Ramsis?
Well, of course, this is not going to change much. And we have to remember that the Olmert cabinet is a continuation of Sharon's cabinet, the previous one. And there isn't anything to cause this axis to change its interaction. And as Israel is going to go on playing the role of a forward post for American imperialism, and whatever Israel may be trying to do, spreading its hegemony in the Middle East, it knows quite well that its relation to the United States is its mainstay. She cannot, I mean, Israel cannot ever go extremely in any way against American interests. And of course, America is always, I mean, the administration is announcing now and again that we will never sort of forget our support for Israel and Israel's security, which security is our sort of greatest important sort of element in our policies and or strategic interest in the Middle East. So they are not going to change that. And the axis is alive and healthy, as it always was and it always be. I mean, so long as Israel is there, this axis is going to exist.
Farideh, any comments?
Well, in relationship to Iran and Israel, and of course, you both know that they have respectively called for the destruction of each other, at least rhetorically. President of Iran has done so, and Shimon Peres just the other day also said, if you destroy us, we'll destroy you. So the rhetoric is certainly very high, but one has to understand what has happened since the war with Iraq, which is effectively, whether United States planned it or it happened, is that Iran's regional power has been enhanced with or without nuclear weapons. Two of its major enemies, the Taliban in the east and Saddam Hussein in the west, have disappeared. And not only have they disappeared, what has replaced them are very, very friendly governments, both Mr. Karzai in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and of course the government in Iraq. And what people don't understand is not only the Shiites, it's also the Kurds. Mr. Talabani, the president of Iraq, has always been supported by Iran in his fight against the other Kurdish factions as well as Saddam's government. So Iran's regional standing has been enhanced, and Iran and Israel are natural competitors in the region for hegemony. And this enhanced rhetoric must be understood not in terms of the desire on both parts to destroy each other, because Iranians are certainly not suicidal to go and attack Israel, because as they have repeatedly said, they think of Israel as a state of United States. That is to say, they think if they attack Israel, they will be destroyed by United States. But it's part and parcel of the aspirations both leaderships have for regional hegemony.
But also for domestic purposes in Iran. I mean,
No doubt, but also in Israel too. I mean, the language of attacking Iran certainly picked up during the election. It was picked up by Netanyahu. Domestic politics in all countries involved play a very important role. It's not only Iran, but it's not only United States that has domestic politics. People have a tendency to forget that. Other countries, there is competition in other countries as well, and in Iran is.
I have a remark to make. This business of rhetoric by Ahmadinejad was exaggerated out of proportion, and it turned out that whoever was translating from Irani to English was a group of Zionists that have strong relations to one of the main leaders in the United States leadership.
Yeah, it was. The translation was done by MEMRI, which is an organization that does translations, and it's very much influenced by the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee. Its members are in both committees, and indeed, Mr. Ahmadinejad's rhetoric was one of questioning Israel's existence as a political entity. In effect, he talked about going back to the one-state solution, where all the people who live in Israel, in Palestine proper, would vote. It was nevertheless very bad timing, because people managed to connect it to the issue of nuclear capabilities, and the fact that with nuclear capabilities, so it was very much blown out of proportion. But nevertheless, the Iranian leaders should know that that's part of the game too. But what is so interesting about this whole dynamic is that Mr. Ahmadinejad said this in a, in a context that he did not think that he was going to become publicized internationally. But once he did, he liked it, and he kept going on precisely because of the kind of support that he gets domestically, not only domestically,
and
but also
yeah.
in the Arab world,
Yes.
in the Islamic world in
Of
general,
course.
because people like the idea of somebody finally standing up to the United States. In fact, he just sent a letter to President Bush, gave him, I don't know if you have read the letter, but it's a letter where half of it is about Palestine and how could the United States allow that kind of atrocities. So he has an audience.
Right. The propaganda has a double-edged sword,
Of course,
I mean, absolutely. But I want to ask you a question about, we would hear before about the democracy movement in Iran and this and that and the other thing. So given all this kind of, especially recent elections in Iran, I mean, that brought Ahmadinejad. So what happened to this democracy movement and so on, reform movement?
First of all, the hardliners in Iran, organized. They had a very, very organized, not a very large, but they did what organized groups do in elections. They manipulated vote. They lead opponents, because the opponents were not as organized. But ultimately, Ahmadinejad had a platform of economic justice that rang true to many people. And his opponent, the former president, was connected to corruption and everything else. So he won by in a landslide. But in this process, what I tried to suggest to you before, the hardliners in Iran got help from outside, got help from specifically the United States. Iran for 8 years had a reformist government that was very much interested in compromise, very much interested in coming back into the global community, and they did not, under any circumstances, get, in fact, over the nuclear negotiations. Ultimately, the Europeans and the Americans were unwilling to come halfway. And in the process, the hardliners end up telling the reformists, we told you so, that all these giving in to the outsiders will not work. So in effect, the foreign policy of United States, I cannot say brought the hardliners back to power, but it certainly helped them.
Yeah, but one wonders why the U.S. had that kind of imperative.
It's a complicated issue. I do not see it in conspiratorial terms.
No.
The United States has always had a very, very ambiguous relationship with Iran. That is to say, and this goes back even before the revolution. It has never been able to figure out whether or not to promote autocracy or democracy, whether to go for its economic interest or pursue some sort of more opening. So
They were supporting the Shah.
I know, no. But even during Shah's time, they brought him to power. But then in 1960s, they forced him to have a white revolution, to have, to have domestic reforms. So their relationship with Iran has always been, for example, with Pakistan, United States has always had a very definite relationship. We don't care who is in power, as long as it is in sphere of his faith. They never pressure Pakistan into any. But in Iran, there has always been a duality, even strategically. For example, they never knew whether Iran's border should be where the Soviets should be stopped or inside Iran, whether it's there has always been a fight about Iran in American government, and today there is also a fight among those who think they should engage with the Iranian government, and those who say if you talk to the Iranian government, you will legitimize this Islamic government. So that has given American policy towards Iran an incoherence that you do not see anywhere else.
Yeah, but actually this is not only with Iran. I mean, it is with Iraq, it is with on the question of Palestine, as well on the question of Saudi Arabia, except like in the question of Palestine, because the Zionists are much worse than that.
No, in the question of Palestine, you see a progression, Ibrahim. United States did not have this kind of policy in relationship to Palestine in 1950s and 1960s, and you see a progression of change. United States becomes increasingly pro-Israeli to the point,
especially since '67, of course.
So that, but the progression is in a unilinear line. In the case of Iran, you see a duality, a constant shifting, not knowing exactly what to do. And, and it could be institutional, like during the revolutionary time, there was a fight between the State Department and National Security Council. Again, today, there is a fight between, State Department and the Defense Department. All sorts of, all of these things gives a incoherence to American foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran that has had consequences. Iran is the only country in the world that the United States has absolutely no presence in 30 years, and there is a reason for that. Yeah. It's not only that the Iranians are crazy, it's just that United States cannot make up its mind, and you can see it through all sorts of various strange endeavors. The Iran-Contra affair, the taking of cake, or secret meetings, the Afghanistan cooperation, and then turning against. So there is a constant shift and incoherence that I think it is historical.
Yeah, well, that's fine. But there's still this thing about what makes that kind of tug of war among various elites in the United States. That's an interesting topic. Maybe we cannot delve into it right now, but that is always something on my mind. Why is that? But I want to ask you about this commentary by Rosa Brooks. She's an associate professor of law at Virginia School of Law, University of Virginia School of Law. And she says the clock's ticking to start of the next war, and that between now and September of this year, Israel is going to attack Iran, and the whole region is going to go down the tubes, much more so than it already has. So we were talking about it before, but could you say something about what you think of this kind of commentary and perhaps similar ones, and then we'll ask Ramsis also to comment on the commentary.
I personally see these kind of commentaries as part and parcel of politics of brinksmanship. I sort of see it whenever Iran's case is at the United Nations or the International Atomic Energy Agency. You see all these stories being planted in various newspapers about the possibility of Israel attacking. And I think that, it's a way to pressure Iran into a series of compromises. Do I think that there is a viable threat? The threat is always there. Israeli Air Force is very powerful, and it is true, as this article says, that the Iranian line of defense against Israel has been its missile systems. And there is the Israeli worry that Iranians will actually put nuclear warhead on top of those missiles. All the studies that I have seen suggest that Israel is not capable of performing the kind of multi-target attacks that will be required versus the Iranian military nuclear installations. It certainly will need the American agreement, because it has to fly, Israeli planes have to fly over Iraq, and the United States cannot, under the circumstances, say, I didn't know anything about it. Everybody will know that it is the United States that has agreed to do it. And I think, from what I understand, the Israelis themselves think that this is a job that the United States should do. And those elements within Israel, and it's very important to understand that within Israel there are people that are very much opposed to this, and were very much opposed to the war in Iraq. Those elements who are for the attack against Iran very much like the United States to do it. They want to stay out of it.
Yeah, that's good. Anything to
Well, I beg to differ. I think that this is a probability that is standing and is going on, and that's because Israel is interested in breaking any entity that resists Israeli hegemony in the area and supports the fight and struggle of the Palestinians. So any of these countries that show that they are rising technically and, you know, from the point of view of building and a culture and building technology and all that. They don't want them to exist there. So this is a possibility that is there, especially when you know that the United States has provided Israel with those bombs, that, you know, tunnel-piercing bombs that go deep into the ground. And it has been said at that time that this is especially for attacking Iran.
Yeah, but those were right around the meetings, IAEA meetings. That's what I'm trying to say. Exactly at the time when the International Atomic Energy meetings meets, they have all these stories planted.
I believe that this is a standard sort of probability.
It's important to note about this article that, you know, Brooks talk about this in relationship to the missiles that Russia is selling Iraq or wants to sell Iran. But the thing is that she basically says to avert that, one should have to like twist the arm of Russia, you know, so as not to sell them the rockets. So there's like a way out of that, so to speak. But I want to go to another segment. Farideh is talking May 13th, 2003. And talking about the unilateralism agenda in the Middle East and U.S. power limitations. And these are like to kind of summarize what we have been talking about. So we'll watch that and then final words of wisdom, shall we say.
I mean, there are two phases to the operation.
Right.
I mean, the underpinning logic of the neoconservative argument has been that American military dominance, in effect, gives the United States the privilege of unilateralism. Now, that worked. If you think of the war in the case of Iraq,
Quote
only
unquote. It worked. They went and destroyed everything.
Exactly, and brought Saddam's statue down and effectively and declared the war ended. Okay, obviously, however, in the process of convincing the world that the United States has a right as well as the might to invade Iraq, the American neoconservatives had to promise the world a lot of things, including the idea that they were going to bring prosperity to Iraq, they were going to bring democracy to Iraq, they were going to bring not only democracy to Iraq, but also the whole Middle East. They were going to take care of the Palestinian-Israeli problem. So that's a full agenda. So Iraq, in effect, has become the test case for this whole argument for American might. And it is here that I think Americans are coming face to face with their own limitations. Obviously,
Okay, that's good. I mean, it's interesting what you were saying about the limitations in terms of the United States. What do you think? I mean, about this tall order, you know, about democracy for not only Iraq, for the entire region. I mean, what happened? I mean,
I guess you cannot bomb people into democracy. I guess that's what we found out.
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
All these, you know, items in America's agenda, claimed agenda for going into Iraq, were not mentioned at the same time. They were sequential. The first pretext for going into Iraq was weapons of mass destruction. The next one was getting rid of Saddam. The third one was to quell the insurgency. And now it is to build Iraq or democracy. So they were not mentioned in the same list. They were pretexts one after the other. To try to explain that, I mean, they are living as they go.
That one. Any final?
I just will say for American people, I mean, is the realization that the American military might has tremendous destructive capabilities, but it has very limited constructive capabilities.
Yeah.
And, you know, it is for us also to come to terms with that reality that, yes, we are powerful, but then what?
Yeah, and again, you know, the U.S. Can win the war, but can't win the peace, and that means losing not only the battles, but the war in a strategic sense.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're flat out of time. Thank you for this kind of discussion, and thanks for our viewers, and see you next semester.
Thank you.
Yeah.